much. Yes, as I think quite a few of you will know, I'm coming towards the end of my PhD now. I've got 4 months and 4 weeks to go, so we're getting there. And it's a complete pleasure and delight to be part of a day entirely dedicated to women in the lute. And rather remarkably, it's actually my second event relating specifically to early modern women and music in 2 weeks. Just less than 2 weeks ago, I was actually in America. It was my first ever experience going to New York and Washington, D.C. To present this, actually a version of what I'm going to be talking to you about today, which is a section of the work for my PhD. But I'm also doing a bit of a recital for you, and I've decided to sort of sandwich the talk between two little bits of playing, because I think we just need a bit of coming back to the music every now and again. So I thought I'd both start and end with some of that. So my program today doesn't really specifically relate directly to what I'm talking about, which has a lot to do with images and my experiences doing historical reenactment. But I really wanted to bring a program of music that related very closely to female musicians from the early modern period, but actually not to focus so completely on looking exclusively at compositions by women, which is something that can sometimes seem quite difficult to find. But actually I wanted my program to highlight how involved women were in the music that we're actually reasonably familiar with, that there really is a co-authorship to a lot of Renaissance music, that is really embedded in the culture, the way that music was relayed from one manuscript to another and adapted and changed and often performed predominantly by amateur women. I really wanted to acknowledge their involvement and ownership, co-ownership of a lot of this music. So I'm not going to talk any more than that, just because I will be talking to you quite a little bit more after this first set. So I think you've got, do you have a program? I'll do a little rundown of what I'm going to do. So I'm going to start actually rather unusually with an exercise which comes from the Margaret Board Lute book, and I wanted to start with this because well, on one hand it gives me a warm-up, but also it's a little demonstration of, you know, very realistically what a young lady would have played when she, you know, before embarking on a more challenging piece. You know, an exercise like this was really part of the pedagogy, and I think it's actually quite interesting to hear that. I was quite amazed when I saw a very clear exercise, sort of a study written into a lute manuscript, followed by a preludium, and then a collection of pieces, dances, all written in honour of women. So I've got the lady banning her Almain, the La Volta of Mrs. Lettice Rich, or Lettice Rich, the Lady Phyllis's Mask, and a courant, again, all from the Margaret Board. And then a little selection of toys from the Jane Pickering Lute book, and I'll stop there in the programme and complete with the ML Lute book at the end. So no more talking for me for now. involves the analysis of musical and textual sources, but also a lot of visual art, and also embodied practice-based research that relates to my expertise as a lute player, and also my experiences getting involved in historical reenactment. So when I mention to people outside of Lute Society meetings that I'm no musician, I'm typically asked what instrument I play. It's a very welcome question, yet I tend to feel a little awkward when I have to tell them it's the Renaissance lute, worried that they might not know what this instrument is. Some don't, but those who do usually recall the instrument from when they've seen it pictured in famous medieval, Renaissance and Baroque artworks. I'm not surprised that depictions of lute players in art tend to stick in people's minds, as these images tend to be evocative and imbued with a sensuousness or a frivolity, or perhaps a sense of grandeur and splendour that is quite captivating to see. As the most iconic instrument of the Renaissance, the lute was used frequently in visual art to communicate specific symbolic ideals or allegorical messages. Virtues that could be communicated included mathematical precision and the divine harmony of the spheres, but conversely, the lute could be used to communicate many vices, the effeminizing ecstasy of sound, lewd insinuation, or the suggestion of a pregnant belly. So the first image I want to show you is, as you'll see, not related to the lute, but it represents with a crystal clear clarity the usage and importance of symbolism in early modern English portraiture. I want to talk about this image as it's so obviously fantastical, and this will really help to contextualize things when it comes to looking at the portraits of lute players, which are coming up next. So the so-called rainbow portrait depicting Queen Elizabeth I is a really spectacular work of art which expresses a plethora of messages via the silent language of visual symbolism. The portrait, which was clearly commissioned by either Elizabeth herself or an advisor, was designed to dazzle, inspire, and intimidate various audiences. When it comes to the symbolism, firstly and sort of most obviously, she's holding a rainbow in her right hand, and it does look a little bit like a slightly transparent plastic tube now, but it was coloured, it was sort of painted in the colours of the rainbow. And it's so clearly fantastical and exists to represent peace. The rainbow is the symbol of peace. And also, as she is able to hold the rainbow, it indicates that Elizabeth herself is the sun. And the little Latin inscription above her hand indicates, it sort of implies this. There's also the alarmingly realistic eyes and ears which embellish her gown. I don't know if you can see, but across the orange of the fabric, there are these very realistic eyes and ears, and it really communicates the Queen's power and influence. Sort of say that she has eyes and ears everywhere, that she can see and hear all. But also, to me, it also suggests that the world's eyes and ears are on her, sort of, again, honouring her importance. This last one is slightly less obvious, but this painting was created in around 1600, when Elizabeth would have been in her late 60s, and yet her face is ageless and beautiful with this porcelain skin, so it really is not a realistic portrayal of her face, but one that is strategic and really supposed to symbolise the ideals that she was trying to portray. So then if we have a look at an image which does involve a lute, not yet being played by anyone, but just the lute as an object in its own right, this very famous painting by Hans Holbein pictures the two of the most powerful men in Europe, and between them are a variety of different mathematical and scientific devices which represent innovation, advancement, power and dominion over the known world. And yet the warped skull in the foreground suggests a sinister undertone. It's the memento mori, that there was also a lot of grief going on and difficulty in this period, and that indicates that. And then the lute, which is being used as one of these implements that references the divine harmony of the spheres and precision and perfection and harmony. If you look very close, the broken lute string really flips that idea on its head, and all of a sudden the virtues that the lute can symbolise, it's more illustrating discord. But that's quite a subtle little detail in there, so it's so cleverly used and very symbolic. When it comes to broken lute strings, the idea of a broken string can be used very poetically. There's a very strong connection between music, and very particularly the lute, and the emotions or the humours of the human body. There's a pun in this emblem book between the strings of the lute and the heartstrings, in this idea that music could affect the emotions, the humours, the heartstrings. Crops up multiple times. An English example is the lute song "When to Her Lute Corinna Sings" by Thomas Campion. In this poem, a woman's musical ability sort of equates to the power that she has over the emotions and the heart of the listener. There's a line that reads, "But if she doth of sorrow speak, even from my heart the strings do break." So a lute string breaking, when she but speaks of mourning, it indicates that Corinna has a quasi-magical ability. And the idea that music and lutes, particularly in the hands of women, was a very powerful tool, and specifically she wielded the power to influence men's emotions and even men's bodies. It's also very, very poetic to think of the lute as a broken lute string as a discord and destruction of perfection, particularly because, as we all know, lute strings can break quite easily. So this idea that discord and disarray and destruction is so close to something that is so perfect is just such a wonderful example to use to symbolize this idea, and it so often was used in that way. This poem is a very positive example of a woman being able to influence a man's emotions. It's sort of painted in a way that celebrates this idea, but conversely, it was taken to quite humorous places at times, as this next engraving indicates. I kid you not, but the word lute was often used as a code word for vagina in this period. There's a fantastic article by Pamela Corrin which really explores this in quite a bit of detail. But this is a fantastic example that illustrates this. So the caption underneath it's almost like a cartoon, like a humorous little cartoon, but it reads, "Master Jan Baldhead, please restring my lute. I will not, woman Lungnose, do not tempt me, because I have to keep something for my wife. She also likes to have her lute tuned." So it goes to show that people really haven't changed. But as was mentioned earlier, I think the lute was actually used as a symbol, sort of a badge of the trade of the courtesan in this period. And I noticed actually after seeing this engraving how much courtesans are pictured in the act of tuning their lutes, and I think there really is something very, very saucy about that. It is an innuendo. So these paintings are by Gerrit van Honthorst, and there's one in particular which is a bit of a favourite of mine. The Procuress is particularly suggestive. So we've got the Procuress on the far left, it would be for you, suggesting this particular lovely courtesan to the gentleman with the coin purse. And you'll notice that while their hands don't touch in reality, the shadow that they cast over the belly of the lute, they appear to be entwined, and it's over the rows of the lute. It really is very, very, very suggestive. And again, the lute is there, it's not being shown as the aim isn't to try to accurately depict a setting really in which a lute would be played or a way that it would be held or played, but as a symbolic object, and that's really the point that I'm trying to illustrate with these examples. So with this being the background context to a lot of images relating to the lute, it's not surprising then that only 3 portraits exist that picture a named Englishwoman with a lute. And in all 3 cases, the lute is held symbolically rather than played, and it's held as a signifier of a dedicated, talented, wealthy, and above all eligible woman. To be seen in the act of playing teeters on that delicate line when it comes to propriety. So we've got Lady Anne Clifford, Lady Mary Roth, and Lady Isabella Rich pictured there. There are other examples of early modern English paintings that picture a woman playing a lute, but these are allegorical images, purely symbolic, and not a named lady who's being represented. So this example here, the Death and the Maiden, the message is really the contrast between life. So we have this beautiful and the beautiful sensuous vitality of the maiden musician juxtaposed with death, who is never far behind. It's very similar to that idea of the broken lute string in a way. So given this context, this image of the Queen playing a lute is really quite remarkable. But we have to remember that it was a private image that was gifted to a potential suitor. This wasn't something that was put on sort of wide display. But a very, very intimate and sensual depiction of the Queen. It's really, really quite surprising. But the Queen really knew how to use music to her advantage in this way. There are several examples of her using music to she had to be quite strategic and sly about it in a way, but to be able to perform music for ambassadors or visitors to court under the guise of it seeming like an accident, that they'd just walked in on her. She knew how to do things like that. So I think this is an example of that kind of skill that the Queen had. And there are many accounts that speak to how much of a fantastic musician she was. So it's not surprising that she would want to use these sort of intimate and sensual symbols of that, as a monarch. Other symbols in this image don't stray too far away from the Queen's monarchy. So the use of black and the fact that what she's wearing is really covering her communicates modesty, but also wealth, as black was actually a really difficult fabric to dye. That really true black took multiple dyes, a very expensive and laborious dyeing process. And then also the crown globes in the background, the throne, the crown, it's still really connecting her with monarchy. Similarly, this portrait of Lady Grace Talbot is a great example of a similar idea. So there are many, many aspects of the painting which portray her modesty and her wealth and her devotion, and the instrument is there again more like a prop in the background, but suggesting something of her accomplishments and her sensuousness, and particularly because music was used as a very enticing accomplishment that a lady could acquire to aid her in marriage. There was a benefit to being able to indicate that you were fertile and sensual in ways, but it was really about very delicately suggesting this in a way that was still showing propriety. The use of black is something that I've been coming across a few times in my research, which I'm quite interested by, particularly when Tony Johnson, the lute maker, showed me this fragment of a lute that he has in his possession, which was blackened. Even over the front, it's sort of, his thought was that it was blackened, and then the black has been partially removed or largely removed, but I wondered if there was some aspect of, not only within portraits, but in day-to-day life, people would have been doing things visually to express their inner virtues. And I wondered if black seems to have a connection, particularly with modesty and with Protestantism, and if perhaps even instruments were painted black, sort of dressed in black in order to portray a certain sense of modesty. I'm not 100% sure about my final conclusion about this thing with the colour, because it does seem to be largely actually a display of wealth to be able to dress in black because of the labours involved in creating it. So it's a bit of a mystery to me, this blackening of lutes, but really, really fascinating, and it seems to at least be a way to present some kind of ideal or to symbolise something. I'm really, really fascinated by that. So through all of the analysis of various images of lutes that I was doing, I kept being perplexed really by how in so many cases, in almost all cases, I just couldn't understand quite how the woman was supporting the lute, how the lute was staying upright. It seemed to be held by seemingly invisible forces, and particularly how it was being held at that upright angle that we require when we're playing the lute. Sometimes you see a table involved. That was something I would come across quite regularly, but it wouldn't really indicate how that angle was being maintained of the lute being held upright. And I know from being a player that you absolutely mustn't be using your left hand to hold up the neck, because your hand must be free to move up and down the fingerboard. And that is detailed as well in Tutors from the Time. That's not just something I can glean from my own practice, but that is, you can read that in source materials, that the left hand must be free to move. So I really did find it very, very perplexing. And there's no visible use of a strap. That was a question that was really arising for me. So I started to wonder, where can we look for a more reliable source of information about how lutenists held the instrument? A good option is the surviving lute tutors, and one tutor in particular contains a very detailed description of how to hold the lute. So this is from Thomas Robinson's The School of Music, and I'll read this quote. "First, sitting upright with your body, lean the edge of the lute against the table and your body against the lute. Not too hard for hurting your lute, neither too softly for letting of it fall. For the table, your body, and your right arm must so poise the lute that you have your left hand at liberty to carry to and fro at your pleasure." So this really is quite a thorough and realistic description of how to hold the lute, and I thought, in order to recreate this and see what that looked like and sort of to compare that to some of these images, I thought no better way of doing it than to try that out myself. So I want to take you to part 2 of this presentation, which is all about my experiences getting involved in historical reenactment and my performance practices research. So I'm incredibly thrilled that Carolyn is actually here today, because it was Carolyn who very it was so enthusiastic about inviting me to come to some historical reenactment experiences. At first I thought I would just sort of come along and take some pictures and sort of see her play the lute and maybe see what I could learn from a research perspective from that. And she's told me, well, I could do one better, why don't we put you in some of the clothes? And I have to say that was one of the most fantastic things to have come about, and my decision to go ahead and do that was one of the best decisions made during the course of the project, because of the amount that it taught me. It really was the most valuable experience to get in costume and try to reenact these things that I was seeing described in tutors. It's a very new way to go about research, but something that's really being very encouraged these days, and you know, not only is it interesting, but for me, incredibly fun as well. So, firstly, the process of getting dressed. I learned so much, you know, with this that went beyond lute playing skills, but about fabrics and the modular aspects to the clothing. A little bit of a compilation here of the stages to me getting dressed. You can kind of see how many different pieces and sort of the modules to the outfit that get put together. And there were a few decisions that I made here in terms of what I wanted to recreate, because I was very, very interested not in recreating some of these very lavish outfits that you see in portraits, where you see a lady with all of her finery pinned all over her bodice and this kind of thing, but something that would be more realistic to what a young gentry lady might play when she was at home in the comfort of her own private chamber and entertaining herself with her lute practice. Also, I became aware of the fact that England at that particular time was very, very cold. They were going through a cold spell, which has been termed the mini ice age. So I was also quite interested in wearing something not only comfortable but warm, just to try to recreate that scene, a more realistic scene than the one that we often see in portraits. So you can see here I've got quite a fantastic silk velvet robe with a rabbit fur trim. You know, it was fantastic, kind of swanning around, feeling like a princess for a couple of days at Bramwell Hall doing this. And something that was quite fascinating to me as well were the stays. So a stays, or a pair of bodies, is the name for what you might think of as a corset. It really isn't called a corset. And usually it's called a pair of bodies because it would be 2 pieces of fabric that would be laced front and back. But mine is only back laced, particularly because I'm to be a lute playing young lady, I would be of a particularly high status and quite wealthy. So to have only a back lace stays indicates your wealth, because it means that you would have to be laced in by a servant, and I had to be laced in, not by a servant I would say, but Carolyn helped me get in and out of the clothing, which meant I was stuck in it, you know, when I was in, until I could convince somebody to take me out. But I noticed that meant I had a very, very flat, smooth surface on the front of my body, which was particularly well suited to playing the lute. I'll talk more of that about that in a second, but it was very fascinating to me, and really I had a very, very smooth, quite firm, flat, hard surface to rest the lute against my body, which was actually something that was one of the biggest eureka moments when it came to the posture and how the posture works. So then I basically reconstructed Thomas Robinson's description of how to hold the lute. So using the table, there's no strap involved. There's actually not even any kind of grippy surface involved. So when I play, and when many of us play the lute, we use some kind of a cloth or a piece of leather or something like that to help to steady the lute against our bodies. But I found using this technique, and particularly being in the costume and using this technique, a few close-ups here, the lute was beautifully balanced between those three opposing forces. So that the table, that very firm, flat, hard surface, and then between that and my body, which was with the stays, a very, very flat, firm, solid surface, and then the weight of my right arm, it was just beautifully balanced. And I wouldn't have realized quite how much it was so beautifully balanced until I tried it. And for me, I had this eureka moment in realizing that the clothing wasn't an obstruction to lute playing, but it actually worked in accordance with it. It felt like part of the technique. It made so much sense, and even clothing of a higher status with that only the backlaced way of fastening it even seemed to make sense, that there was such a connection between the activity of lute playing being a very high status thing and the clothing. It suddenly seemed so obvious to me, and it hadn't before. And I'd tried this without being in costume, just at home against my desk and things like that, and I was always half convinced by it, but not entirely convinced or entirely secure. But it really was a different story when I got to try it like this. So it really goes to show how valuable this manner of research is. I then had a second experience at Skipton Castle, which was really quite magical because this was the home of the aforementioned Lady Anne Clifford for a time. So it was really quite special to get to play the lute here for 2 whole days, and I couldn't help but get one of those rather cheeky tuning your lute images captured while I was there. So I was really interested to see if any depictions of lute players show this way of playing, this accurate depiction of lute hold. And I was quite delighted to come across this painting of Nicholas Lanier. So it's anonymous, we don't know who painted this, but Lanier was an English composer, musician, active in the early 17th century, and he was also a painter. And I thought that there is a possibility that this is a self-portrait, and something that indicates that could be true. This was something that was pointed out to me by an art historian, is the fact that he's looking directly at the viewer, as it were, so it could have been done with him looking in a mirror. It's just something that I don't think in all cases, but can be a slight clue to whether something is a self-portrait. But as you can see, he's using that tabletop way of playing in a way that seems to be physically accurate. You know, it makes sense based on seeing the images of me holding the lute in this way. And I thought there could be some reason why Nicholas Lanier would want to depict himself playing using a very excellent technique, because he was a professional musician and probably a teacher, and to be able to advertise his excellent musicianship and his excellent technique could have been something that would have been valuable to him, more so than presenting himself in a way that was mostly about being beautiful or sensual. So I was then very interested if any women were depicted in this particular way, and I did find a few examples of them using the table, and you can see the lute dipping slightly beneath the table in a way that makes sense in that way of holding the instrument. But I do notice with these, ever so slightly more than with Lanier, that their faces seem to be very, very drawn towards the audience, and the shoulders and the neck are very much on display. There seems to be a slight preference in these cases for the beauty of the sitter being very much on display, and a slight perhaps male gaze in comparison with Lanier. But it's still really, really fascinating to see this being presented. So this really reminded me of a quote from the mid-17th century lute tutor copied by Miss Mary Burwell, within which she gives the following advice: "To look cheerfully upon the company, the grace and cheerfulness in playing not being less pleasing than the playing itself. One must then sit upright in playing to show no constraint or pains, to have a smiling countenance, that the company may not think you play unwillingly, and show that you animate the lute as well as the lute doth animate you. You must not stir your body nor your head, nor show any extreme satisfaction in your playing. You must make no mouths, nor bite your lips, nor cast your hands in a flourishing manner that relishes of a fiddler. In one word, you must not less please the eyes than the ears. And I was really, really fascinated by this description because to me it's the definition of virtuosity. The act of lute playing involves a skill akin to what I think present-day models or figure skaters or ballerinas will understand so well. That there's an extraordinary skill, strength, support, and sort of rigidity at the core of what the artist is doing. But what the overall result must appear to be is graceful and effortless. It's this nonchalant or virtuosic playing that was so desired and heralded in the Renaissance, mentioned most famously by Castiglione, but the idea appears in many, many writings from across the continent and, of course, from England as well. So the end goal and the appearance of effortlessness can make it reasonably hard for the viewer to tell exactly what's going on underneath. And I think this could be a factor that's led to the unrealistic portraits of lute playing. Even in real life, highly skillful lute playing is something that appears quite magical, and the skillful holding of the lute can appear to defy the laws of physics. I want to mention as well that the reality of this particular photo being taken, so I was actually slightly aware of the fact that my image was being captured at this moment, and I did almost subconsciously adjust myself to be ever so slightly more pleasing to the camera, I raised the lute ever so slightly upwards so that you could see more of it. I was all sort of aware of that and, angling myself in a way that would make for a good picture. And I thought noticing myself do that was slightly revealing in that it's part of the art in a way, or part of the act, and likely something that ladies at the time, if there was somebody who you were courting and they entered the room for a moment, you might adjust yourself to look particularly pleasing. And I was able to play music in this way, but it was slightly more precarious. It's not something you would do over a long duration of time. But if you were posing for a portrait, or if you were taking an advantageous moment to sort of self-fashion yourself into the most graceful version of, the way that you could present your body as possible, it may be added to this, this slightly laws of physics defying way of holding lutes. It maybe was something that as part of the act and the art of playing the lute as a lady. So, in conclusion, depictions of female lutenists are fantasy images crafted to communicate specific messages, virtues, vices, and allegory. Descriptions of lute posture in the surviving lute tutors differ significantly from the majority of the artistic depictions, and through my own experiences working with historical reenactors, I was able to gain new insight regarding the reality of lute playing for women in the period, and in a very new and exciting way, I hope. Thank you very much. Okay. Well, we'll finish up with just 3 more pieces. Another set of dance pieces this time from the ML lute book, which is seems to be definitely a female-owned one because it's a Margaret L. Unknown surname, but another Margaret. This time, Miss Mary Hoffman's Almain, Miss Anne Markham's Pavan, and Mrs. White's Choice. you.